Hey, welcome to the show. We had some big news today in that Brazil has released some regulations around cryptocurrencies and digital assets. And so today we're going to break down what those new regulations are, how I think they're going to affect all trade within the BRICS alliance. We also have some news about India and a new sovereign gold bond that they have issued. And what does this mean for anybody who's a holder of a utility asset like XRP? Hey, welcome to the show. My name's Molly Elmore, and today we're going to talk about the BRICS Alliance and some news that has come out of the two of the countries, Brazil and India, and kind of how we think that might affect things moving forward. So, BRICS officially passes crypto regulation bill. That was pretty exciting news. There's a couple of articles. I did want to just read from one of them. President Bolsonaro on Thursday approved a crypto regulation bill recently passed by the country's Chamber of Deputies. This law establishes a crime of fraud involving virtual assets with a penalty of jail time plus a fine. It also creates a virtual service provider license, which is to be requested by digital asset companies, including exchanges and trading intermediaries. So this sounds to me like a delineation between a stock exchange type of service like an E-Trade and something that is specifically designated to manage virtual assets. So curious to see in the US if our regulations will separate an exchange of digital assets as something that is different and regulated differently. That is actually my prediction. I think we're going to have a unique set of rules for crypto in the US. That is my total speculative guess. But it makes sense to me versus trying to fit it into a box that doesn't really describe digital assets very well. Okay, what else does it say? Digital assets that are considered securities, according to new regulations, will be supervised by the Brazilian SEC equivalent. Those that do not fall into that category will be overseen by a yet to be named created body. So this implies that some of these assets will be deemed a security. Obviously, others will not, and they will be managed separately. So, would we see something similar in the US? My prediction is there will be a new classification for some of these assets. Again, this is just my guess here. But then some will that are clearly a security would fall into the SEC. There was a NFT land sale earlier in 2022, I guess back in maybe Aprilish, where Yuga Labs, who is the creator of the Bored Ape Yacht Club, was launching a metaverse project called The Other Side, and they sold NFTs as sort of land in this new metaverse. And this arrangement, in my opinion, sounds an awful lot like a security. They specifically stated, or this was my understanding, that they were going to use the funds from this NFT sale to build out this metaverse. And you got to own plots in this metaverse with a clear expectation that once this metaverse was built, these land plots would be worth a lot more. So that sounds a lot like the Howey test, where plots of land were sold to investors to grow oranges on them. And once these oranges were, yielding fruit, the land would obviously be worth more. So I think that many of these assets like XRP are not securities, but some of these NFT projects very much sound like securities in my take. So I think to assume that none of these assets would be securities is a little bit short-sighted. I do expect there to be some that are. And so in the US, that means that the SEC would manage some of them. But then this question becomes whether or not something that's not a security, is it considered just a currency? Is it something else altogether? We're still kind of trying to figure that out. And it's one of the reasons why I'm looking at regulations for other countries is the US may adopt something similar. All right, what else was in this article? One thing that was very clear is it did state that a virtual asset is a digital representation of value that can be negotiated or transferred electronically and used for payments or as an investment. So I think the payments delineation is pretty key, in that we would be able to, or if you're a Brazilian at this point, you would be able to pay bills like taxes, utility bills with a digital asset. So that would be required, obviously, if they introduced a central bank digital currency that's considered a digital asset. You have to have some kind of rule, I guess, in place for that to now be considered legal tender. But this could also mean that stable coins could now be clearly acceptable as payment for official bills, taxes, that type of thing. And that would also mean maybe that companies could use these types of assets for payroll, because typically big companies like to follow sort of what the government issues and deems as being legal tender. So that's kind of exciting, pretty big deal. I didn't see anything that was a concern to me or anything that looked like it was government overreach. So I see this particular set of regulations as being fairly positive and bullish. I also came across some interesting stats on crypto usage by country, and sort of thinking about this with BRICS in mind. You can see that quite a few, if not all of these BRICS nations are in the top ranking countries by crypto transactions. So India is top, China, Brazil and Russia are in the top 10. South Africa is kind of rounding it out as well. Let's see what that is: 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. So that's like 12 or 13. So it does show you that these nations are looking to make transactions using digital assets. You can call that crypto for now if you want, but it's just showing that there is a comfort level with the technology among those nations. Is that random? Is that a coincidence? My guess would be no, that this is being done to prepare these nations to move towards a new monetary system that uses this type of technology on the blockchain as they prepare for kind of movement towards asset-backed currencies. All right, separately, there's some news out of India that I didn't really notice, but I was doing some research into asset-backed currencies and this particular kind called a sovereign gold bond. We're actually going to have a whole episode next week about this specifically, but I wanted to just talk about what I'm seeing in India and their announcement that there's a window right now. I think it was the 19th to tomorrow, the 23rd, where this particular type of gold bond is available for sale. Now, a sovereign bond is essentially a loan that you issue to the government. You lend them money, you buy this bond, but it's a loan, and then they will pay you back with interest. And these bonds are backed by gold. Now, what I'm not clear on at this point is if this sovereign gold bond is connected to any kind of digital asset. There's an infographic created by one of my favorite YouTube or Twitter researchers. I don't know his name. It goes by XX133 and a bunch of other numbers. Very cryptic name for his account, but he has an infographic that talks about Indian sovereign gold bonds and implies that they are connected to Stellar, and that, if you buy this bond and we wanted to be able to trade this bond on the blockchain, I would get a digital asset issued to me that is a representation of this bond that I could then custody myself. I could only hold it in my wallet, and then I could potentially trade it, sell it, whatever. So I'm still looking for some confirmation that these particular sovereign gold bonds could be traded via the blockchain. But more significant and more big picture, this does indicate that yet another BRICS nation is moving towards a gold standard of sorts. And what does that mean? It's a return essentially to gold being considered money. We saw that the BIS months ago labeled gold a tier 1 asset, which in essence means that it is as good as money. When we talk about this return to a gold standard, I think sometimes I've done this. I think of that very literally, like our dollars would now be redeemable for gold, and that gold essentially becomes money. There might be a transition phase that happens over time. And even Tom Luongo has talked about this, that one way that the Fed could solve the US debt problem, other than just like collapsing the system, is to monetize the US gold supply and basically convert the debt into some kind of gold tied bond that would have a very long, like you'd have to hold this bond for a long time, but it would be a way for that debt to be converted to something else. I'm not sure if that will happen. I think that's an interesting idea. I'm definitely considering continue to learn about it. But the thing with India is much more promising because one, these bonds are being issued. It is showing a remonetization of gold. India is part of the BRICS alliance. We've already seen Russia move towards this. China is also extremely bullish on gold. Um, they have a rule. My understanding is there's a rule in China, like you can't export gold out of China. That China mines gold in China, which must stay in the country, and they also purchase gold from elsewhere. So there's a lot of confirmation across the board that the BRICS nations are very bullish on gold and have intentions to remonetize it. This is also confirmed by the BRICS reserve currency announcements that came out months ago. I'll put a link in the description for a video I did on that a while ago. But the plans for the BRICS reserve currency is to issue a basket currency, which simply means that it's not backed or commoditized with just one thing. That if you are a small nation who, let's say you produce oil and you produce corn and you produce, some sort of other steel pipes or something, I don't know, some kind of asset that could be essentially traded or bartered on an open market, that could become collateral for this reserve asset to be issued. I do have quite a few questions about this, to be honest. Like, what happens if you use a commodity like corn and like the corn goes bad? Like, how does the asset get removed? Like, there's some things I'm not totally clear about in terms of some of these commodities being used. But the idea is that resources that a nation has could now become collateral for money, which significantly means a shift away from credit being money. All money right now is essentially a form of an IOU, towards money that is being based on actual assets of value. And the nice thing about this idea is that it's not just saying that there's only one type. It's not just gold. That if, let's say, you are a small nation, but you have one particular resource that's really valuable, maybe some mineral or something that you mine there, that could now be considered money. And you are able to participate in the global trade system without having to go into debt for it. Because the scam with the debt money system is that the person who can mint money out of nothing can charge interest out of nothing. It's truly one of the most ingenious business models, if you sort of can take any emotion and the sort of dark consequences out of it. But if I have the ability to make an IOU out of nothing and I loan this to you and say, here you go, you can now use this IOU to go buy stuff, but you're going to have to pay me back with interest. And I created that thing out of nothing. It's the most scalable business ever because I can create lots of things out of nothing if there's really no constraint for me to issue more of these things. And then the fact that I now charge you interest on it, and if you don't pay me back, there are all sorts of negative consequences. If you default on a loan, especially if you're a consumer, retail person like you and me, there's consequences. Your credit score gets dinged. You could maybe even have to pay a bigger fine. You might even have to go to jail. All sorts of consequences happen for you failing to repay a loan that was issued out of nothing. And that is one of the challenges I think that the BRICS nations overall had, is that they are not the issuer currently of the reserve currency, that is a dollar. So if they want to trade on the global marketplace, they have to work to create these resources, like they have to physically drill for oil or mine for gold or grow some kind of thing or make some kind of widget, whatever. They have to physically produce some type of asset that can be used that they sell on the open marketplace to get money to buy things. And the issuer of the reserve currency, US, has an unfair advantage because they can print that money out of nothing. Now, you can't make oil out of nothing or make food out of nothing, but you can basically buy whatever you want if you have a credit card that has no limit that you don't really have to pay the bill on. You can just charge whatever you want and buy whatever you want. And that creates an unfair advantage. Now, the United States did have the responsibility of being the global cop and policing the supply chain, which I absolutely think had tremendous amount of value. But sometimes that privilege was abused and political agendas were implemented via the military. And if you dared to disagree with the particular agenda of who was ever controlling the US military at that time, then there are consequences for you. So I'm just trying to look at this from the objective of being a BRICS nation and saying this system is not advantageous to us. So how can we create a system that we think is more fair to us? I mean, if I were one of those nations, I would definitely be considering options that would put me in a better position. And a lot of these BRICS nations, if not all of them, have resources that they could monetize, meaning they could use those resources as collateral for an issuance of some sort of money token, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't have to be just gold. That is my point. So I think it's pretty interesting to see that India has now issued these sovereign gold bonds, which is a step towards the monetization of gold in another step towards this sort of moving away from simply debt-backed money to asset-backed money. I think that it really is a very promising direction globally for trade because the fiat money system where you can print money out of nothing has led to massive inflation, not only of like everyday things that you buy at the grocery store, but homes, cars, stocks. None of those things would cost as much as they do if people weren't able to take out these loans to pay for them. I mean, the price of college, for example, is so off the charts expensive, and no one would go if you couldn't take out loans. Like, very few people would be able to go. I'm not saying no one could, but a much smaller percentage would go to college if loans were not an option. And now what that means is not that fewer people would go. It would mean that colleges couldn't charge that much. They would go out of business. They wouldn't be able to sustain themselves. So they would have to charge a more reasonable tuition amount, which also means that some of the money that they get is used for dumb things. Like a lot of universities build these outrageous facilities, outrageous meaning in terms of their expense and their cost. And it's not really necessary to spend that money on those things because they're getting all this free money. I mean, that's sort of the scam of it. These young kids are kind of being put on the hook for these outrageous tuition bills. Does the quality of the education match a $100,000 a year tuition bill? That is debatable. And then the money that comes in is now being used for things that probably aren't necessary. I mean, the question here is sort of simple. Like, if everybody had to pay their bills based on money that you had in your wallet versus this endless credit card system, which is kind of what this current economy is about, would we have more responsible spending, less corruption of certain industries that are bought off via this money system? So I kind of digress a little bit, but this is what I think that why I'm optimistic in the direction that the BRICS nations are going, and seeing this monetization of assets is it will hopefully, take us back to a system where the power is not concentrated solely in the hands of people who have the ability and the power to print the money. And I think that a lot of the conflicts that we're seeing right now globally if you've watched any of my videos about sort of Davos versus the Fed, there is this big struggle going on. You can refer to this as the Great Reset, where there is a specific agenda by a small group of very, very wealthy people kind of pushing towards more of control systems globally. And that is partly because I think, one, the euro is not ever going to be the global reserve currency. So this group, I think, had hope that that was going to be their power base, and to be able to print euros was a form of power that it has not turned out to be. So in order for them to reassert their power, they have to take out a couple of things. Number one, they have to break up Russia, because Russia is too much of a threat and Russia makes too many things. They also have to make sure China stays in line and stays a subservient manufacturing state. They also need to dethrone the US dollar and break up the US, as it is we are all protected by a Bill of Rights and a constitution that makes some of these nefarious things that this group in Europe wants to implement illegal. And so they have to sort of disparage and break up the US. Ideally, they would love, I think, to get rid of the US Constitution, which is why we've seen a lot of a sort of attacks on whether or not the Constitution is useful and necessary, which is part of that larger agenda. So back to sort of the money thing, is that while I think it would be very painful for the West to move away from debt-based money. I mean, I talked about this in my last video about the Nasara thing, is, to watch the price of housing collapse very abruptly will be painful and devastating for a lot of people, especially those who've worked very hard for decades to pay off a mortgage, and your home is your most valued asset. That's going to sting. But the question becomes bigger. Would society be more would society be better off if we moved towards a monetary system that was more fair and based on assets, a variety of assets? So it's not just going to benefit the people who have gold, but it could benefit people who can make something. Anybody can be a producer of a particular good, because there's a lot of options for what those goods could be. And so it gives smaller nations, emerging markets, what we would call sort of more poorer countries, a shot at trading a little bit more equally, and not ending up in this situation where entities like the IMF have to bail them out because we're in this debt system, and then these debts pile up. You can't make the interest payments, and they're used as a control mechanism. John Perkins wrote a great book, I think it was back in the 80s, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Absolutely fascinating book, disturbing book, but it does explain how these loans are used by the political elite to exert control over some of these smaller, poorer nations. And that just wouldn't be possible, I don't think, or at least not to the same way it is now, if the whole money system wasn't run on debt. It was run more on assets, because you now could have a way to get ahead if you're a smaller nation. That's just not really feasible or possible if you are not able to issue the reserve currency, which no small nation can, and everything is based on kind of credit. So, well, I think there's like a political view of the BRICS versus the West. I don't think it's that simple. Globally, I would personally like to see movement towards these asset-backed currencies, because I think they are more reasonable and fair for everyone, including the citizens of the world, not just for the political leaders. Now, what does this mean for something like XRP or another digital asset for utility? This does point to there being multiple currencies that are asset-backed. And if I am in a smaller nation and we issue not all CBDCs are bad, so be careful of making that assumption. That just means it's a digital asset issued by the central bank. And so if a country issues a CBDC and they have backed it with a particular resource that country has, let's say it's oil and gold, for example, then they go to the global marketplace and they want to trade something, and they're going to buy from a nation that uses a different currency. Well, we don't all need to hold the same currency, right? If there are multiple ones, and we sort of move away from this idea of just having one reserve currency. The reserve currency is primarily to store value. It's not really to make trade payments. But something like XRP and Ripple's liquidity pool, the on-demand liquidity, ODL, that would allow every nation that wants to participate in trade to be able to store their value in the resources that they own, and then go to this marketplace, buy whatever they want to buy, and make this transaction, this currency swap, instantaneously. So this would take away one nation from being the issuer of the reserve currency, which actually hurts your manufacturing and your exporting business via the Triffin Dilemma, but it also gives you this power over everyone else that I don't know if it's in the interest of humanity to have sort of one group rule over the rest of the world. We've just seen that that type of power is corrupting, and it's too tempting to be abused. So I think there's some bullish, just wrap this up, there's some bullish news this week. Brazil's moving forward. Their digital assets are now going to be a form of payments. We see India monetizing gold. This is kind of a step in the direction in line with what we've already seen out of BRICS. Russia's already monetized gold. And we've already seen the announcement that the BRICS reserve currency would be used, which probably be used for trade purposes, would monetize gold as well. So it looks amazingly like we're continuing to see this shift towards asset-backed currencies. This is also bullish for a lot of the utility plays that would be used to make payments and transactions between different countries that hold these different assets. I also think it's continually bullish for gold overall. You know, the price of gold is suppressed via two exchanges in the West. One's in London, one's in Chicago. And the price of gold is suppressed, from my understanding, to help protect the value of the dollar. But that mechanism only works because they're able to control that exchange. So the minute another exchange, like the Russia gold exchange, or even if the Shanghai gold exchange became more open, if there was another major exchange where the price was not suppressed, that would be massive, because it would create what's called an arbitrage opportunity. So let's say I'm a gold trader. I go to London, I buy a bunch of gold at $1,700 an ounce, and I take that gold over to Russia and I sell it for $3,000 an ounce. That's a quick profit. I would probably do that over and over and over until the West was drained of gold and all the gold was now sitting in Russia. That would not be in the interest of the West to allow their gold to be essentially drained and converted over to other countries like Russia, who now have gold-backed money that would essentially give them tons of money. So I think that the suppression of gold in the West, there's a tick-tock indicating that will be ending soon. Because the minute there is a true arbitrage opportunity for an unsuppressed price, I think we'll see a pretty dramatic increase in the price. Now, to be honest, I don't know why that hasn't happened already. It hasn't, though. There's a reason that I'm not aware of why they are waiting for that. I think sometimes these things are on a schedule and they are planned. Now, whether everyone in the global decision-making group is all in cahoots together, I find that hard to believe, because I just don't think they're all friends. I think they also have their own agenda, and they all also want to protect their own individual interests, and not all the interests are aligned. We've certainly seen that this Davos crowd in Europe has their own particular agenda that would screw over many other factions, including U.S. banks, which is why we see Powell and the Fed actively fighting against the ECB and the European money group. So, all right, I diverged and went on lots of tangents in this. Hopefully that's okay. I did just want to share some of this breaking news about Brazil and what I've learned about India. I'm going to have another episode next week. We're going to talk more about asset-backed currencies and sovereign gold bonds. So stay tuned for that. All right, if you enjoyed this, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. That helps me out with YouTube. And I'll see you in the next one.